This week, I've also asked you guys to read two excerpts by Samuel Johnson and Joseph Addison. And there are two kind of commonalities that both of these works have in common. And I talked about it a little bit in the historical context kind of background information that I gave you all, but these were written in a kind of new genre of the time, which were periodicals or magazines, right? Newspapers, so to speak. And these works written by both Johnson and Addison are examples of literary criticism. And literary criticism, as then as now, is not necessarily, well, I mean, I don't want to say as then as now, but because it's kind of evolved a little bit. The modern kind of view of literary criticism is what we see in scholarship, right? Articles that are analyzing or interpreting the written works of someone else. So, like when you write a literary analysis, that is an example of literary criticism, right? When you read an article written by someone about something that you have read, as you will do in this class, or when you're looking for research or resources on a particular text, that is an example of literary criticism, right? But for Johnson and Addison, back then, what would have been considered literary criticism is what's good writing and what's not good writing. And part of that goes hand in hand with this kind of idea or concept of the age of teaching, right? Of giving this kind of social polish to a rising middle class that doesn't have the same background as the aristocracy, right? So if I want to have an educated conversation in society, I can kind of I can look to these people like Johnson and Addison, or Addison and Steele, and I can know how it can help me develop a more competent conversation, right? So the target, and I want to talk about Johnson first, because Johnson and his Rambler number 4. So Rambler was the periodical that it was published in, and number 4 is basically the title of the piece, right? And this is really important, particularly for us, because we will see the attitudes that he has in this particular section over and over again, and particularly in the novel that we read at the end of this class, Northanger Abbey. So his target in Rambler number 4 is the novel. And in order to kind of understand where we're going with this, you kind of have to understand a little bit of the development of the novel. And I'm so interested in this because it's one of the things that I have a lot of of experience with. And for those of you who are doing this in the historical context, not historical context, but the group cultural project, if you have any questions, you can ask me. But this is kind of where you're going to focus. But anyways, the novel, and even the word novel means something new. And the novel as a genre, like as a whole, was not invented or created until the 18th century. And I know that's weird for a modern audience to think about, because the novel is one of the things that we consider to be the pinnacle of good, quote unquote, literature, right? But the novel is something new that comes out of the 18th century, and it really happens because of the development of the middle class, right? It is considered to be kind of lowbrow reading and not big L literature. And these novels of the time were often kind of comical and really catered to women readers. Not that men didn't read novels, but um, men were more reluctant to admit that they read novels because they were not considered to be as elevated and as highbrow as other kind of poetry of the day, right? So women particularly were eager readers of novels, and a lot of novels were written with women in mind because if you think about it, with a developing middle class and a developing literacy in the middle class, you also have this growing literacy among women readers, right? So, anyways, um, the novel or fiction, as he calls it in his Rambler number 4, um, kind of a little bit of a background. The novel back in the 18th century had to be written as if they were not fiction. So a lot of the time novels were written in letter form, or they were called epistolary novels. So if you think back to something like Robinson Crusoe, right, or one of the very first novels, or Pamela, or any number of early 18th century novels, they weren't written as they were now with like a narrator, etc., etc. They were written as a series of letters in order to pass off as being more authentic, or as being not fiction, right? Because if they were written as fiction, they wouldn't have the same kind of credibility, and that really is a reflection of the 18th century and the time in which it was written. Because if you think back to our discussion on John Locke writing to his reader through a letter, right, it gives it that kind of view of being something more authentic, something more credible, right? So these novels, these early novels, also had these kind of humor and insights into the human experience. And they also helped expand literacy and had a wider public audience because they were written in a simpler, more common form of English to be read and understood. So, what happens with the novel and these early works of fiction is that they are not these elevated, grandiose types of writing that you would see in someone like Alexander Pope, or even, John Locke. So, and that's what gave them kind of that lowbrow kind of status. So if you think about, and the best thing that I can think about describing it or comparing it to it by today's standards is if you think of something like 50 Shades of Grey, right? Something that's compared to like lowbrow literature, um, versus something like, Jane Eyre, or Oliver Twist, or uh, Frankenstein, or any number of novels, or uh, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, whatever you want to think of, like any canonical novel, right? The novels of the day, right? Like Pride and Prejudice back in the day would have been considered, like 50 Shades of Grey, right? So these types of works and the authors themselves didn't have that kind of elevated status as other writers. So let us look, and that's kind of where we are when Johnson is writing this Rambler number 4. And his views, he has this very particular definition of fiction. And he says in the opening lines, he says, in the present generation, right? Fiction exhibits life in its real state. It presents ordinary events happening to real people. So for him, fiction is all about verisimilitude, and verisimilitude basically means it depicts normal life. It is, if you look at the root word of, hold on, let me get my life together. If you look at the root word of um, verisimilitude. It's that idea of truth, right? Vera or veracity means truth. And similitude, right? Simulation, right? It's the simulation of being true, or it could be perceived as being true. So for Johnson, in his writing, the goal of a novel is that it should be realistic without being improbable. In other words, if it can't happen in real life, it should not be in a novel. It would not be kind of good fiction. And he does this by comparing um, kind of fiction of the day of his contemporary society to the romances, because novels would have been considered romances at this particular time. He looks at the romances of yesteryear, of the past, and like something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, right? That is not realistic, because in real life a man would never be able to have there's no such thing as magic in real life. There's no such thing as being beheaded and having your head be cut off and put back on in real life, right? So he says that the goal of the novel is to be realistic without being improbable. And he said that it's no wonder that these types of works are popular, right? He says that it's and I'm looking in the text when he says that it's not easy to conceive why readers would not be drawn to these types of works, because they're relatable, they're comfortable, right? They're predictable, they're formulaic. And he says that for he says what does he say? He says the authors were willing to continue, especially back in the day, were willing to continue writing these types of works because for when a man had by practice gained some fluency of language, he had no further care than retire to his closet, let loose his invention, and heat his mind with incredibilities. A book was thus produced without fear of criticism, without the toil of study, without the knowledge of nature, or the acquaintance of life. In other words, that past fiction writers were able to get away with everything because they could use their imagination, they could use their fancy, and they could create something improbable. But the task of the present writer, for Johnson, that's no longer acceptable, because remember, the goal of fiction is to create these realistic scenarios without being improbable. So the task of the present writer is more difficult than the writers of the past, because and he says, and I kind of want to paraphrase just a little bit, that with the modern novels, there exists a complex relationship between the character's experiences, the reader, and the reader's experiences. The reader evaluates events of the novel by reference to his or her experience, and at the same time, evaluates his or her experience by reference to the events of the novel. And I want to break that down just a little bit. And it kind of ties back to what we were talking about with Locke, right? Locke was saying that in order to understand truth, we have to experience it, right? We have to see it, we have to observe it. And that is the task of the present writer. The present writer has to both experience life and observe living in order to create an accurate depiction in his writing. And the challenge is that they're writing about things that everyone knows the original, right? Like, if and he gives us an example about how someone criticized an author for having a terrible scene about a shoemaker criticizing the way some author described as slipper, right? He said it was improbable. So, anyways, the idea that the task of the present writer then is to present a as realistic uh, presentation of life as possible, right? And that is a challenge because the writer has to experience life, but it's also kind of challenging because the reader is meant to experience life through the reading. I hope that makes sense. So, the problem that Johnson says that comes with this is that these books are written chiefly to the young, the ignorant, and the idle, to whom they serve as lectures of conduct and introductions into life. They are entertainment of the minds unfurnished with ideas and therefore easily susceptible of impressions, not fixed by principles and therefore easily following current fancy, not informed by experience and consequently open to every false suggestion and partial account. So, what he's basically saying is that the young readers of novels, are believe that these books reveal the true effects of described behavior. So, therefore, they are persuaded by these narratives of success or failure rather than by arguments or reflection. In other words, they are easily deceived by what they read because they are inexperienced. And the irony, I think, is that, people read, or at least to Johnson, people read in order to experience life, but these novels are giving them a false experience. They are meant to kind of go out and live life by learning something through these novels, but not taking them too much into heart. And I'll come back and I'll explain that a little bit further in just a second. So I think that the best way that I can kind of explain or kind of get at what Johnson is talking about in terms that we'll understand is that, when you grew up watching shows on TV, right? You have, for me, for example, it was Saved by the Bell, right? And I was very young watching, these reruns of Saved by the Bell, or, 90210 or whatever. And I had these very unrealistic expectations about what my high school experience would be like, right? I also, or like these movies that you see about, the high school experience, and it's very different. Like my prom was nothing like, any of the proms that I saw on TV or anything like that. So it's that kind of false representation of life that lead us into having these unrealistic expectations about what the world is like. And that is the problem with novels for Johnson. That is the problem with fiction for Johnson. And I'm going to pick up with this, so stay tuned.